gang members coming to invade us. What they don't tell you is that these two were born and bred right here in the United States. So MS-13 and 18th Street are the largest gangs that are in Central America. Both of those gangs started in the U.S. and Los Angeles. Mid to late 80s, you had a lot of Salvadoran refugees coming from the Civil War in El Salvador, and they settled in Los Angeles in a predominantly Mexican-American community. And Salvadoran kids, they're fresh out of war trauma, and they weren't quite like the other Mexican-American kids that were there already. And so 18th Street, this is a Los Angeles-based gang, had been around since the 60s at this point. So the Salvadoran kids basically formed their response to kind of the bullying and the being picked on because they weren't really like the Cholo-style gang members in that area. And so what ended up coming of that was the start of MS-13. So as gangs do, crimes are committed, kids go off to jail, go off to prison, and their asylum and refugee status was they're eventually deported back to their countries. And remember now that El Salvador is recently coming out of their own civil war. So you have a really very war-torn country, a traumatized country, and these kids being deported, they are very clearly not Salvadoran anymore. Also not really American either, but they're being deported back to their countries, complete with the gang culture that they've adopted, including tattoos, the baggy clothes, the kind of Cholo style, and very much stood out in Central America during those times. They did not look like the average Salvadoran kid. And again, they were very obvious deportees. Deportees tend to be ostracized anyway, but these kids even much more so. The lack of economic opportunities in that time frame really created what we end up seeing now, which is that mesh of the gang culture from the U.S. and the kind of really guerrilla warfare tactics that were going on. So what we know MS-13 and 18th Street for now, which you hear on the news, you hear about the savage brutality, you hear about killings with machetes, you hear about extortion, kidnappings, and sexual violence, which is really what they're known for today, and kind of what all the fear-mongering in our country is about now. We hear about MS-13 on the news probably every day. Our President Trump tweets about them on a regular basis. So, but what has happened though is that trauma has kind of meshed with U.S. gang culture, and in the U.S., gangs generally tend to fight against one another. There's not a whole lot of fear that a gang member is going to come and extort you in your home or in your business here in the U.S. But in Central America, that is really a phenomenon that they're seeing. And so what has happened now is, and you see this with the kids that you receive in your programs, is that the families are really traumatized by the gangs, and they really live in fear. Every day there's the fear of what's going to happen on my way to school today. You hear of your own clients of being recruited, sometimes in very violent ways, and into participating in gang activity. Sometimes the families are really fleeing and trying to keep their kids away from this violence and being recruited into the gangs. And so there's been various suppression efforts in Central America throughout the years since this happened. So the first was mano dura, which means heavy hand, and this was like around early 2000s, and there was super mano dura, which is, I guess, extra heavy hand. During this time, there have also been vigilante groups that have risen to kind of assassinate gang members on site, and they basically contracted with military and police forces to just basically go out and hunt gang members. But there have been some suppression efforts. They haven't been very successful. Some more recent, there was one called Trabajo Conjunto, which is basically like coordinated effort. And this was an effort between the police and the military coming together to kind of get rid of the gang conflict in the areas. So the police, they knew the areas, and the military was meant to provide kind of the force. Eventually, this was also unsuccessful because what we found was that the military was being infiltrated by the gangs. The gangs were bribing and all kinds of things, and we ended up being members with military-grade weapons. So, what's left in Central America right now is really a state of fear. The average citizen is afraid every day. What's going to happen to me on my way to work? If I ride the bus, is my bus going to be taken over by gang members to either rob us or kill us or blow up the bus, or all kinds of different things. For the kids, you guys hear the kids' stories, what they're dealing with. And so they're fleeing this instability and insecurity in their countries, and this is the reason why we receive the kids that we're receiving. Some of you may, if you have been in a staff secure or secure facility, you may have encountered actual gang members. And I'll say that the numbers of gang members that we receive in our programs are generally fairly low. It seems that the gangs really want to keep their kind of army intact there where they are, their group intact. But a lot of times what we see is gang members, when we see gang members coming to the U.S., we see them coming because they are fleeing their own gang punishments. For example, I worked with a kid, I'll call him Francisco. I'm not going to tell his real name, obviously, but I ended up doing 2 home studies with this youth. And he was 18th Street and had been in the country for some time. He had originally lived with his parents, but was participating in criminal activity while living with his parents. He was eventually locked up and then sent into ORR care. There was some concern about him being released back into the community for obvious reasons, and particularly back to his parents because they had not really done a good job of keeping him off the streets and that kind of thing. Well, in talking with this kid, I did 2 home studies. The first was for his uncle. That ended up not being a viable option. And then the second, sometime later, ended up being again with his parents. And that one was tentatively good. But in talking to Francisco, let's say, the main thing that he was concerned with, and the reason why he had come, was because he had lost or stolen, not sure which one, in which light you want to see this in, lost or stolen a load of drugs. And his own gang was after him. So he had fled certain death, no doubt, if he had stayed home in his country. And in talking to him, his greatest fear was ending up being deported, not being able to really be released back to his family, and ending up being deported back to his country because he knew that he would be going back to certain death. So for a lot, and I'm not going to say all, but for a lot of the gang members that you may encounter in shelter or otherwise that are coming from Central America, many times the reasons are not what you might think. The reasons are oftentimes the same underlying reasons that the average kid is coming, and it's really seeking a sense of safety, seeking an opportunity to have a new or better life. And a lot of times they think that coming here, maybe they can blend in and just kind of start over, start fresh, and just kind of leave their past like gang lifestyle behind back home. So I want to, oh good, we're moving forward. So I want to talk a little bit, that's a little history and a little bit of information about the gangs that we're working with, which again is MS-13 and 18th Street. But I have to back up and talk about trauma because, as you know, trauma is really the lens that we have to see all of this stuff through. So many of you, I'm sure, how many of you have heard of adverse childhood experiences? Most everybody. So I will not offend your intelligence, but I will give just a brief overview for those that may not have heard of it. So adverse childhood experiences, this concept of ACEs, is the result of a longitudinal study on the long-term effects of childhood trauma on life outcomes. So we understood that trauma affected children in the obvious ways, like in school performance and school attendance and things of that nature. But some of the things that we didn't know, some of the key findings that this study found out, was that trauma had profound impacts on lifetime health outcomes and otherwise. So experiencing 4 or more ACEs in your childhood increases the likelihood, sometimes exponentially, of having certain types of cancer in your adulthood, of being obese, having heart disease, mental illness, and early death. So it turns out that trauma has a marked impact on our lives over the long term. And I think sometimes we're kind of like, well, yeah, of course it does. But when you think about the health outcomes, you really realize how much trauma marks us. So we have to start from a basis of trauma. And so I want to just kind of throw out, what are some of the experiences that you guys would put into the category of ACEs? Those of you that know, or some that are, just throw out some things that you might think of. Abuse. Domestic violence, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, family disruption, absolutely. So I want to kind of give you a few additional ACEs that sometimes, those are the big ones, but I want to give you some of the ACEs that often are kind of overlooked, but they really apply to our this list. Community violence is there, refugee experience is there, human trafficking, and chronic exposure to violence. So does that sound like our kids? Sounds like our kids. And so we always have to go back to this perspective of trauma. And we know that the effects of the ACEs are really on the whole child. They're holistic in the sense of, you will see effects in their behavior, you'll see social effects, and you'll see emotional effects. And so we really have to stop and think about how this phenomenon is really affecting our children. And so Bruce Perry, who's a trauma researcher, said that this is an urgent public health crisis. In the United States alone, there are more than 20 million abused, neglected, and traumatized children that are vulnerable to these problems. And we as a society have yet to recognize this as an epidemic, let alone develop an immunization strategy. So I want to just look really quickly at the impact of childhood trauma on child development. And I want to look at kind of the whole child. So I don't know if this is easy for you guys to see, but it's kind of a little bit of every part of the development. So I want to talk first about physical impact. So gang members are generally seen, and I'm going to talk in a general form right now. I'm not just speaking about Central American gangs, because this is something that can be generalized across the board. But gang members are used to being seen as kind of outside of normal society. And many times this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. For example, I feel rejected, so I'm going to create a persona that ensures that I will be rejected. That includes getting tattoos, not just regular tattoos, but tattoos in crazy places, tattoos on your eyelids. I mean, what else? So that includes violent behavior. That includes just being an intimidating persona, kind of making that when you walk in the room that people are like, what is going on, So, but they experience some physical impacts as well, some consequences of their behavior that can be very serious. They experience injuries, obviously, sometimes hospitalizations, physical punishments from their own gang, and of course, even death. The emotional impact is really, severe. I don't think that sometimes the kids realize, in fact, I can guarantee you the kids don't realize the depth of the emotional trauma that they're experiencing. Most gang members have very severe trauma due to witnessing, perpetrating, and being victimized by gang violence. So that not only are they creating gang violence, but they're also being victimized by gang violence. You'll see a lot of PTSD symptoms, among other mental health issues. The social impact is, what you'll see is a lot of difficulty in interacting and socializing with peers outside of the gang. And again, this goes back to feeling like an outsider. If you feel like you're not part of normal society, then, it's really hard to interact with people that are like normal people, And so it really kind of perpetuates this cycle of keeping them out of quote unquote normal society and keeping them in kind of in their own little world. Next is the intellectual impact. And, we know that trauma affects brain development. We know that it affects our ability to problem solve. But in addition to that, gang members' education is also often limited. It's interrupted by their behaviors. You see a lot of school dropout. You see a lot of skipping school, things of that nature, being kicked out of school for behaviors. And so while there's a lot of potential there, oftentimes it's not really ever fulfilled in an intellectual way because of their disconnect from school. And the last, I think we oftentimes leave off the spiritual being, but I think that this is really important, and particularly because we are faith-based organizations for the most part here. But I think that it's important for us to remember that there's a spiritual impact here too. And a lot of times what you see and what I hear oftentimes is, God can't forgive me for what I've done. I can't forgive myself for what I've done. So basically this feeling of I can't be forgiven. What I've done is so great that I can't be forgiven. So again, we start with this trauma-informed lens when we talk about working with gang-involved and gang-affected youth. And as youth workers, we have a great power. We have the power to perpetuate those ACEs and re-traumatize kids, or we have the opportunity to buffer the impacts of trauma by building relationships based on respect. So what I want to ask you guys is, do the gangs have it all figured out? Have they figured out something that we're not getting? Because sometimes it seems like they're reaching at-risk kids a lot better than we are, doesn't it? Do you think that the gangs could be meeting their needs in ways that we aren't? So remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm going to take you back to freshman year psychology class, everyone. So we have basic needs that need to be met before we can move towards self-actualization, right? These are basic. We know this. We all work in the social services field, so I'm not going to go through Maslow's hierarchy again for you. But we all have those basic physical and emotional needs that have to be met. When they're not met in a safe way, what happens is maladaptive substitutes step in. And this is what we're seeing. This is what's happening. So we're going to talk about those needs. We're talking about a few innate needs. I'm not going to go through everything, but I want to talk about a few really key needs that really fit into the population that we're talking about. The first is safety. I start here because this, for me, this is the most basic place we can start. Survival is a daily struggle for many of these kids. They are constantly in the mode of fight or flight, hormones firing, adrenaline is high. It's hard to find a sense of calm. When your adrenaline levels are constantly elevated, even when you're in a moment of calm, what we've found when research has shown this is that those hormone levels never really drop. They never allow the kid to really find a sense of calm, a sense of peace. So there's a lot of questions. I've said them already. Am I going to make it through today? How am I going to survive the walk to school? Will I make it into adulthood? Well, the gangs tell kids that they're going to do whatever's necessary to help them survive. And each one in the gang is going to help the other survive because we have a loyalty, we have a brotherhood. And so we're going to help each other survive day to day. Oftentimes we find that the gang provides better for the basic needs of the kid than their own family does. So we see gangs providing shelter for the kids. We see them providing food. We see them providing assistance to their families when their families are not making it day to day. We see even education when it benefits the gang. And this is more so with particular gangs in the US, but even education, if it benefits the gang, they're going to help you go and continue your education. We even see with particular gangs in the US that they'll send their people to the military to learn strategic thinking and be able to bring that back to their gang tactics as well. And what I found is that most of the kids, they know the consequences, the potential consequences of joining a gang and being involved in gang activity, but oftentimes the pros still outweigh the cons. It's worth it. The risks are worth it because I've got to survive. So we as professionals, we can meet the need for safety by helping them find ways to find a safe home. That may mean helping them relocate. If they've been involved in things either here in the US or abroad, we may need to help them find a safe place that's not where they are right now. And so that may mean helping them relocate to another side of town. It may mean helping them relocate to another city or even another state in order to be safe. And this is something that definitely, goes to the family because the family also is not always safe. And so we have to take involved in the gang, but yet they are being impacted by this lack of safety. So the next one is family. And this one, for me, this is probably, we start with safety because I feel like it's so basic, but family is probably, as humans, we have an innate need for belonging, for unconditional love. And when true family is not available, or if that family is a source of trauma, then we are always going to seek out another family. We're always going to seek out another group that we can be a part of if we don't have our own true family. So what happens with gangs is, again, it's a maladaptive substitute that is brought in to fill the gaps. So most of these youth come from very dysfunctional families, and so they're seeking to get this need met in another way. The gang is that perverted version of family. For them, it's where they give and receive love. It's where they learn discipline. Again, these are maladaptive forms, but yet this is, sometimes it's like, this is the best I've got. So this is what I'm going to attach to. This is what I'm going to hold on to. They provide a sense of brotherhood, a mentorship. A lot of times you see like father figure, which is like the OG kind of mentoring and like discipling a younger kid. And when that relationship is really hard to be broken. So I had a kid that I worked with, a Central American kid from El Salvador named Christian. And I worked with him for quite some time, and he had a lot of potential and a really strong desire to live a different lifestyle. He really didn't want to be living the life that he was living. And yet he had this tie to his OG that he could not let go of. It was so strong, it was like a puppet master at work. When I tell you that this guy would say, jump Christian, and Christian's response immediately was how high. This is how, it was so strong. And not to take any blame off of this kid and what he has done, but he got called to a mission. And he's currently serving 50 years in Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He's not going to see home again. He will be deported back to his country. And so this is what we're dealing with. We have to step back and think, how would you feel if your father said, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. This is the person who raised you, who's shown you love, taught you what our family is. It's hard to break that. It's really hard to break that. So we meet the need for family for these kids by helping them belong to healthy family. Sometimes for many of our kids, that's helping them find loving foster homes. That's helping them find church groups, mentorship programs. Sometimes it's even helping them reconnect with their biological family when it's appropriate. And we provide supports around that, like counseling and parenting classes and things of that nature. But we really have to work hard. It's hard to find families for kids like this, right? It's really hard to find families. So you really have to do a lot of strategic recruiting when you're dealing with this population, and prepare your families for what they may be receiving if you end up getting, and I know many times if you have a gang member coming into shelter, it's highly unlikely that they're going to get to foster care, but they could, And so again, we try to connect them, and we try to be, whenever possible, those people who can be a support to them as well. We build relationships. I'm going to go back to saying over and over again, build relationships based on respect. Build relationships based on respect. We show them genuine care. And it's so important when I say genuine on purpose, because in shelter setting or in other settings, school setting, there's this kind of false sense of care sometimes. Like, oh, yes, we care about our children. But then when it comes down to it, when they're misbehaving, sometimes it doesn't come across as care and love, And so we really try to show love, concern for their well-being, concern for the things that they're concerned about. And, remind them, you as a professional, as a foster parent, as whatever your role may be, remind them that you're available to talk. Now, they're not going to talk to you right away. I'm going to warn you. They're not going to talk to you right away, because relationships like this take time. It takes time to build these kind of relationships, but be genuine, because they can spot a phony a mile away. So the next area is boundaries. We know every good family has boundaries, rules, consequences. Gangs are no different. Now, these rules and consequences don't look like what we would say are good things. However, we know that kids thrive when they have clear-cut boundaries, when they have understood consequences when they break a rule. The gang provides this for them as well. Now, there are different, levels of kind of strictness in gangs. Some gangs have very strict codes written down, almost like Bibles. Others have looser codes, but there's always very clear messages about the boundaries and the consequences. Those consequences are most often meted out in a physically violent way. And, this serves really to reinforce their trauma, and trauma bonds them to the gang, just like an abused spouse is to their abuser. So we meet their needs for boundaries in the same way. because they're used to following rules, they understand rules, they understand consequences. We provide them safe boundaries, safe rules and consequences. We let them know that we are not going to respond in a violent way when they break rules, but we're going to give them loving kind of redirections in another way. So again, it doesn't look like the rules and consequences and boundaries that we would be familiar with, but yet we have to teach them a healthy sense of rules and a healthy sense of boundaries. There was some research done some time back about kids playing on the parks, playing in parks, different types of parks, and what the outcomes were. And so for kids that played on parks with no fence, no boundary, they tended to stay very close to the playground apparatus. They stayed close to the slide, close to the swing set. They didn't venture out very far. But the kids that had a park with a very clear boundary were free to play out to the boundaries. They were free to go out to the fences, to go out to the farthest boundary and explore in ways that they wouldn't have been had they not had that boundary. So I think this is such a real illustration for us as well, that boundaries really do bring freedom for kids. When there's no boundaries, they will push out, waiting to find where the boundary is with you. And so if we start off by having very clear boundaries with our kids, that breeds a sense of safety with them and a sense of I'm free to explore. I'm free to kind of figure out who I am within these boundaries. And so one of the ways I think of some of the kind of really practical ways that we can do that is, providing boundaries around simple things like office doors being open or closed, or if there's a window or something of that nature. I worked in a school for quite some time, and I had one kid that liked to come to my office. And he would come to my office and immediately close the door. We didn't have windows on our doors. He would immediately close the door and come and sit down. This is really weird to me, but he would come and sit down behind my desk on the floor right by my feet. And he did this one or two times, and I finally was like, you can't do this. This is not appropriate. You have to open the door and go sit down in a chair in my office. We don't do this. We don't do this sit on the floor thing, because it's, even though I'm not going to do anything to you, it's inappropriate. And that was a very simple way for me to draw a boundary, but he never did it again. And so this is a good example of how we can even simple boundaries, they bring freedom. The last here is loyalty. So I'm going to use kind of a churchy term here for those of you that know this term. There are very few backsliders in the gang world. Why is that? Have you ever thought about why that is? Why it's so hard to let go of the gang? There's very few backsliders. Once they're indoctrinated into their gang, it's really rare that they will denounce their gang completely. It's not that it's unheard of, and it does happen, but it's rare. They're indoctrinated and trained so well that leaving the gang never really seems attractive. Because in the gang, you know what? They're never truly alone. They have someone to fight with. They have someone to fight for. They have something important in their mind to fight for. And they know that their brothers are meant to be loyal to them and to carry on their legacy even after they're gone. So I had many years back, this was probably in the very early 2000s, I had a kid that I worked with in another school district in Houston, and so I've reconnected with him over the year. Facebook is a wonderful thing, a wonderful, weird thing, to interact with kids that you knew, 20 years ago or something. But this kid is, mid-30s now, probably. I'm not really sure how old he is, but I'm assuming he's around mid-30s. He's got a job. He's got a kid. Normal life, but he still claims the gang. And he is, every couple of months, I see in his Facebook, he is out to the cemetery celebrating some commemoration of his homeboy's death or something in their life or their birthday or something along those lines, and keeping the legacy going of this homeboy that passed. They're out there with some beers, pour one out for the homies. This is real. This is a 30-year-old guy that's still doing this, Why do you think that is? Again, it's like I have this loyalty, this brotherhood that I can't let go of because this is what I've got. These guys are going to be loyal to me. I'm going to keep this guy's legacy going because I know if it were me, they would keep mine. So we meet the need for loyalty by, again, just earning their trust, by being consistent and reliable. I want to remind you again, this kind of relationship takes time. You really have to be willing to get your hands dirty. Trust is essential. So I really say be patient. Be a person of your word. Don't break their trust. But once you earn their trust, you're in. And I've got a great story for this. I had this kid named Junior. Junior was one of the very first kids that I met when I started this work and doing volunteer work in the mid 90s. And I'm going to tell you some more about him in a minute. But he was a really very vivacious kid and just really an interesting kid. I met him when he was 12. But around the time that he turned 13, he was going to trial for something that he had committed. I don't even remember what it was. But he had made some pretty drastic changes in his life. He and his brothers had started getting involved in a church group, and they had really started to turn their lives around. And so I went to court with him, and we presented to the judge to have him go to a faith-based kind of group home as opposed to going to a juvenile lockup facility for his crimes. So I took him to this interview with the faith-based home, and this is on the other side of town. Not at all familiar to him, vaguely familiar to me. And I'm going to date myself here, you guys. So this was in the days of pagers. I got a page and stopped. We're in, for those of you that know Houston, we're in Pasadena. And had to stop in Pasadena, a random street corner at a payphone. And so my thought is, and I'm all of maybe 20, 21 years old. I was a kid myself, but I'm here. I tell Junior, stay in the car. I'm going to go make this phone call. I'll be right back because night is falling. It's not really, safe-ish. And so I turned around, and I'm pretty smart. I'm aware of my surroundings. I'm on the phone. I'm talking. I'm, paying attention to what's going on. I'm checking on Junior in the car. And, I go to hang up the phone, and I turn around to walk back to my car, and I find, now, you guys remember the club that goes across the steering wheel, kind of the safety thing, right? So I find Junior wielding the club like a baseball bat. And I'm like, what in the world are you doing? Like, get back in the car, child. And he's like, Miss, I saw somebody trying to come to talk to you. I had to protect you. And this is his literal response. And I'm thinking, you're 12. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. He could probably protect me better than I can protect myself. So, but my point in saying that is that once you build those, that he had to take care of me. In his mind, he had to take care of me. And that was because of the relationship that we had. Excuse me. So again, we build our relationships based on respect. And respect is so key that I have to kind of give a little caveat about respect. It's so key when it comes to understanding gang members. In the gang world, respect is synonymous with being feared. And this is the basis for their reputation. And their reputation in the gang world is everything. So as we focus our discussion on how to interact with gang-involved youth, we start with respect. And so things that we would not consider to be slights are even things as simple as a look. You look at me too long. Why are you looking at me? Why are you mean mugging me? Whatever. I mean, there's all, even something so simple is a kind of a diss to them. So we have to kind of take it back and remember that we have to treat them, with the same kind of respect that we as adults would want to have. The same way that you would want to be treated. And I know many times we say, well, if they treat me with respect, I'll treat them with respect. I want to flip that around because we're the adults. We lay the foundation. We bring the tone of the room. And so we bring their respect. We respect their human dignity, even when they're misbehaving, even when they're not lovable. We respect their human dignity. They may need correction. They may need redirection, but we can still respect basic human dignity. And one small piece that I want to add in here, don't talk bad about gangs or about particularly their gang in front of them or within their earshot. Remember, let's go back to the family thing. This is their family. This is what they know. This is dad, mom, brothers, treat as family in many cases. When you talk bad about a gang, and we know being involved in a gang is not a smart choice. We know this. They haven't quite figured that out yet. They know it may not be exactly what they want to do with their life, but they're there. This is where they're at right now. And we have to meet them where they're at. So I would suggest not even focusing on the gang issue. They're a gang member. You may have to ask them questions if you're filling out an assessment or a form. I echo what the speaker said yesterday. Give them the reasons why you're asking these questions. Let them understand this is why I need this information, because it gives them some context. Because otherwise, again, it does feel like an interrogation and they're not really sure what you're going to do with this information. So I don't even really focus on the gang issue. I know my kids are involved in gangs. I don't really care. I mean, I do care. I want them to be different. I want them to do something else with their lives. But that's not what my focus is. My focus is on how can I bring value to their life? How can I do something positive to help them take a step out of the gang? Because ultimately, I can't save them from the gang. I can't change their lives. They have to make a choice on their own. And I have to lead them there, but I can't make the choice for, just like I couldn't make the choice for Christian. This is the kid that went, I think I told you his name anyway. I couldn't make the choice for him. He had to decide whether or not to go with his OG or go to whatever thing we had going on. He had to make that choice. So we lead them there, but we can't make the choices for them. And remember, your relationship is not with the gang. That's an entity. Your relationship is with an individual, that kid. And you're building a relationship with that kid. So they're in a gang, I don't care. I do care, but that's not my focus with them. I want them to know that I care, that I'm there, and that I can bring help to whatever their situation is, whatever that may be. So Dr. Pedro Noguera from UCLA said that the best way to meet the needs of children with ACEs is through relationships. So again, I'm going to go back to that, relationships based on respect. We build relationships based on respect. So one of the things that I try to do, and this is probably like the crux of everybody asks, like, how do you work with these kids? Well, this is what I do. As I'm getting to know them, I try to find ways to interact and just to find common ground. But one of the things that I like to do is ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And that's a really normal question, right? Well, remember Junior, I told you about Junior with the club and, his whole protecting thing. So I met Junior again when he was 12 years old. I met him, he was sitting on some apartment steps and he was high as a kite. I don't think I even knew that at the time, but I knew that, he was just there and needed some assistance. And so my first question was, and again, I'm like all of maybe 20 years old, so I'm just asking questions that people asked me when I was 12 years old, because this was normal to have this kind of conversation of, what do you want to be when you grow up? So I'm asking Junior these questions, and his response still to this day, and this is 25 years almost later, still to this day, his response floors me. No one ever asked me that question before. I've never even thought about it. And I don't even think I'll live to be 19 years old, so why bother? That moment, I go back to that moment because that's one of the first very strong interactions that I remember from my early days in working with gang-involved kids. And it really changed my life. I remember going home and thinking about this for a long time and just trying to understand this. So that's kind of become a starting point for me. Where do you want to be when you grow up? And that's a kid that has no hope, really at 12 years old, no hope to live past 19 years old. And luckily, I will tell you, Junior has lived past 19 years old and never went back to jail again. He's doing great. But I start there asking them, what do they want to be? Where do you see yourself in 5 years from now? Where do you see yourself in 10 years from now? And many times they can't answer that question. Many times they have no earthly idea what they want to be when they grow up. So we have to take it even smaller. Go back to even more baby steps. What do you like to do? What are your interests? What's your favorite subject in school? Well, before you stopped skipping school, what was your favorite subject in school? So we start there. We start with very, very simple questions. But once they come up with an idea of what they want to be when they grow up, let's say teacher, for example. I want to be a teacher when I grow up. Awesome. You want to be a teacher when you grow up? What do you have to do to get there? Go to college? Okay, yeah, you have to go to college, but let's take it back a little farther. What do you have to do before that? Graduate from high school? Yeah, I think there's some other things you might have to do before you get there. So we got to back it up all the way to the beginning. Start with the very simplest of goals. We help them determine very baby, whatever you think is a small step, break it down even smaller, because I guarantee you it needs to be broken down even smaller. For most of these kids, achieving a positive goal is very new to them. Some of them have never achieved a positive goal in their lives. And so We try to start with very, very small, attainable goals to help build their self-confidence in these areas because, again, this is so new to them. So new. Positive goals and achieving a positive outcome for them is very, very new. One of the kids that I've had the pleasure of working with for many, many years and still in very close contact with is a kid named Jordan. And Jordan I met, he was literally living on the streets. He was about 14 years old and barely ever came to school. But this kid was really smart. Somehow he had like all A's and B's in most of his classes, and he literally almost never came to school. So I started digging a little further and I found out, my God, this kid is really, really smart. I'm like, Jordan, do you realize that if you just came to school, you could have like 3 more credits on your transcript right now? If you just you need credit recovery in 3 classes, you passed everything, you passed the final. He's like, how? I didn't even come to that class. Somehow you passed the final, you passed that class. So little simple things like that kid went from being a freshman to being a junior in literally a matter of a couple of months, just by doing some exams, some credit recovery, and a couple of things. That kid had so much boost from that little thing, just that little thing, that he found his own apartment. He started coming to school. He went to night school, ended up graduating on time, and he's now a junior at University of Houston downtown. So it is possible. Now, I say that to say there are examples of great success. Let me remind you though, it takes a lot of time. This is a kid that I've been working with for 10 years. So we try to help them keep their long-term goal in mind at all times. And I want to give you an example of this. One thing I tell the kids is, I want you to take that. I tell them, write your goal down. Write it down on a piece of paper. I want you to put it somewhere, either in your house, in your wallet, wherever you're going to see it on a regular basis. Put it on your wall, put it on your bathroom mirror. And I want you to think about that goal every single day. You told me you want to be a teacher? All right, teacher, write that down. I want you to see that goal every single day. Now, this sounds simple to us because we've all done SMART goal workshops and all that other stuff. But we're talking about 14, 15-year-old kids. They don't know what a SMART goal is. So we're teaching them this in very small ways. So I talked to them about, I want you to pretend like that goal is written on the inside of your glasses. You put that goal right here every day. I want that to be the first thing you see when you wake up in the morning. I want it to be the last thing you see when you go to bed at night. Because if your goal is out here, somewhere far out here, I have a lot of distractions. I can see all of you. My goal is somewhere there. It's out there, but it's way out here. But if I put my goal right here, I can't see anything else. It's my main focus, and that's what I'm going to reach for. And again, we revisit this conversation very often because, as we know, those goals tend to go out here and they don't stay up here that close very often. So as we revisit those conversations, we remind them to get that goal right up where it needs to be. Okay, now I'm going to ask you guys to indulge my nerd side for just a minute. There's a purpose for this.
What I'm getting at is, I've got another crash car. The eggs are supporting 3/4 of a ton already, but could the double curved shape let them hold more? Can they take a second car? Let's go to the fun part. You'll hear them say things like left a bit, right a bit. Oh, I can hear cracking again. I can hear cracking. Some rather intriguing cracks I can hear there. These eggs have delivered. I mean, they're ready. That's 2 cars. I think the proof of it. Thanks to their double curve, these eggs are supporting over 1.5 tons. One final thing, just in case you thought, yeah, hang on, they're all hard-boiled eggs or made out of concrete. I'd just like to prove they are all real. raw eggs. Ava, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, line up your wire. A bit closer, a bit closer, a bit closer. Are you happy?
Yep.
Okay, right, let's go. 1, 2, 3, go.
Yep. Definitely real eggs.
Strongly digging, and then close to that shape. Double pull.
Okay. So for many years, you guys, this video like totally touches all of my buttons here. I have for years said I've likened gang members to a raw egg. There's a tough, really tough outer shell. And you see that? That eggshell can withstand so much pressure, so much pain, so much difficulty. But you hit them in just the right place and you're going to get a big mess on your hands. It's gooey and soft and all kinds of stuff on the inside. You're rarely going to see that, but you got to hit it in the right place. So I say this to say, again, you got to be willing to get your hands dirty because change is slow, but it does happen. So I want you, there's some papers in the center of your tables there. If you guys can, we're going to do this really quickly for the sake of time. I'm going to move fast. But I want to do a little quick activity about identifying strengths because as this video of the egg illustrated, there's a lot of strengths in the kids that we work with. So I want you to take just a really quick minute. You don't have to go through the whole list. Take a minute or so. I want you to put yourself at the age of 15. I want you to think of an adult that was close to you during that time. It could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could have been a mentor, someone that was close to you around that time. And I want you to circle 6 or 10, character traits that they would have described you as at the age of 15. Oh, I don't know where it is. Okay. Okay, just maybe 6 or 10 character traits. Now I want you to think of a kid that you work with now. It could be your own child, it could be some child that you work with in your facilities or in your programs. And I want you to place a check mark next to 6 or 10 of the character traits that you would identify in that child. So you should have circles for character traits that an adult would have to character traits that you identify from the child that you know. So let me ask you, did you see yourself like this, the way your adult saw you at age 15? Did you see yourself like this when you woke up this morning? How about the child that you identified? Did they see themselves with those character traits that you identified in them? What if they could see themselves in that way? What if they knew that you saw them in this way? What if we could start speaking to the virtues and the strengths that we see in them rather than just not even talking about negative interactions, but even just saying things like good job, which we think it's a really benign statement, good job, way to go. But those don't really call out virtues and strengths. What if we started to identify those strengths and started calling them out? I really see a lot of confidence in you when you talk to your friends. I see that you were really showing acceptance the other day. And we call out those virtues and help them to see themselves in that way. So we see strengths in gang members, things that you might not expect. And I want you to think about those things. Think about leadership skills that need redirection, strategic thinking. Again, a lot of desire to live a different lifestyle, but not really knowing how to get there. There are very few sociopaths in the world. Most of the kids that I interact with really don't want to live the life that they're living. They really want to be different. They just really don't know how to get there. Again, we talked about loyalty, we talked about respect. I've found that gang members will show you respect to the nth degree if you show them respect. Of course, as we know, there are always challenges, and I want to very quickly talk about what are some things to expect in the range of challenges. You're going to see a lot of feelings of worthlessness, depression, rejection. Again, these kids are used to being seen as outsiders. They're used to being seen as evil and villains in the story of their lives. And in Central America, many of these kids, there are very, very few social service agencies that are available to address their needs, and particularly to address the needs of gang-involved youth. Many, even churches, are not willing to get involved with gang. And so, they really experience rejection from all sides, and that really is a pervasive feeling. It lasts through a lifetime, the feeling of being an outsider, and it leads to a lot of mental health concerns as well. We talked about already PTSD, but particularly you may see flashbacks, you may see startle responses. You heard our youth yesterday talk about the 4th of July and fireworks and wondering what was going on. So you may see things like that. You're going to see things like paranoia, sleep disturbances, and a general feeling that life doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I die. And the gangs really sell that idea to the kids that, you're going to die anyway. So if you go do this mission and you die, you're dying for the cause. You're dying for our gang. And we're going to hold your legacy on. And some of the ways that we deal with these challenges is, of course, we know trauma-focused therapy, and this is very, very helpful. But I want to introduce some of you may or may not have heard of EMDR. EMDR is a very specific form of therapy that is proved very effective with trauma victims. It's been used a lot with rape victims. It's been used with survivors of war. And in many cases, that is what our kids are. They're survivors of a gang warfare that we may not identify as a war, but yet it is. And so the way EMDR works is, you guys remember those old-fashioned library card catalogs, right? Well, imagine that every memory that you have in your life is one of those cards from the card catalog. And generally speaking, the memories are filed away, the door closes, and our brain is able to stay in homeostasis, right? When you have a traumatic memory, however, that memory kind of sticks out. It's a card that sticks out and won't really file back in where it's supposed to be. So your brain is constantly trying to close the drawer there and get back to homeostasis. But every time it's closing, it's hitting up against that traumatic memory. That memory becomes more and more traumatic over the years because it really can never be filed back where it's meant to be. What EMDR does is it's a way of processing traumatic memories to help it become a non-traumatic memory, just a memory. And it engages both hemispheres of the brain during therapy, and it works. I don't know how to explain it, but it works. And it's, again, very effective for trauma victims. We teach things like conflict resolution and anger management because, again, these are not usually skills that the kids that we work with have. We try to give lots and lots of encouragement. I talk a lot about scaffolding, the idea of scaffolding and providing supports, a lot of support at first, and then slowly pulling the support away, allowing them to really go and fly and do what they're meant to do on their own. But we celebrate small victories, all the little things, the little goals that you've identified and helping them achieve. You want to celebrate those and really kind of pump them up because, again, those are just very new to them. And so lastly, I'm going to just put up here, I'm not going to really get into it a lot, but we have a best practice model, which is about 80% of our efforts in working with gangs are really focused on prevention, 80 to 85%. Focus on prevention. This is the youngest group. Intervention is about 10 to 15%, and this is kind of the middle teen years, the kids that are just getting involved in gang activity. And suppression, which is law enforcement, that is really not our job, and I try to stay away from that side of it personally, but that should only be about 5% of our efforts. And those are for the hardened criminal, the guys that have grown and continued their gang activity. But again, the goal is safe and healthy communities. So I'm going to stop here and allow for questions at this point, so, or comments? Yes?
When we're talking about giving respect to youth that are involved in gangs, something that I find valuable is the importance of making them feel like human beings by shaking their hands formally. So I mentor at the local juvenile detention center, and I introduce myself as Hector, and I ask for their names. So I feel like the fact that you're showing like some physical contact formally they make themselves, they feel valuable.
Oh, absolutely. And I find a lot of times that the kids that I work with, oftentimes they don't even know how to give a real handshake. You know, so it's really like modeling that behavior of what a handshake looks like, how is it supposed to feel when you give a handshake, when you receive a handshake, what is that supposed to feel like? And I like your idea also of really using their names. I had one guy that I worked with for a really long time. He's still a friend of mine. But when I first met him, the only thing I knew him as was Wicked. Well, really quickly, I wanted to know what his real name was, because I am not going to call you Wicked, I'm sorry. And his name was David. And so David is a good friend that I've stayed in contact with for probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. But I think using their given name is very valuable, and it gets them out of that gang persona, because if your nickname is Payaso, I mean, do you really want to be calling them clown? Is that what you want to call them? I mean, is that the virtue you want to call out of them? No. Is that the strength you want to call out of them? That's not what I want to call out of them. I don't want to call my child clown. Really, I agree with you absolutely. Using their name and a healthy physical touch is very important.
And also sharing our own personal stories, like our struggles. So the way I try to interact with young people to share about my family dynamics, about growing up in a single family household, growing up around gangs, so they can relate and understand that you can overcome those challenges and be successful.
For
You
sure.
can have like a positive role model in life.
Absolutely.
Trying to bring guest speakers as well that can relate to them.
Yeah, and I think it's very valuable, you know, having a similar experience to what some of the kids have. But I'll say that I'm probably the unlikeliest of gang interventionists. I mean, really, the unlikeliest. But for whatever reason, it's worked. And I really think that the key, and this is what I can sell to you that may not have had the experience that our kids have, is that what has worked for me is genuine relationships based on respect. That is what has worked for me for 25 years. And what I can say is that they know that I care about them. They know that I love them. I didn't grow up like you. I'll admit, I didn't grow up like you. I grew up in a suburban family with two parents that loved me. I am here because I care about you. I'm here because I genuinely love you. And that, I promise you, makes all the difference. You don't have to have grown up like they did to reach their hearts. But it does help. Sometimes it really gives you an in where you might not have had an in. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
Maybe a comment, like again, respect. And sometimes when I think about how like respect can mean fear, like learning and like discovering what else respect can be, and that is a language of the heart. Like
Yes.
you said, like if there's genuine concern and curiosity about like your hopes and your dreams, like that's showing respect. Whether it's
Absolutely.
just all those different levels.
Yeah. Thank you.
These youth are going to discover.
Yes.
And
Yeah. There's another one?
I'm curious because I think our kids from foreign countries, and we have no idea what they're, or sometimes we have some idea.
Mm-hmm.
Really first-hand knowledge of anything they know. I'm always curious to know their relationships in the camps and their villages where they came from and what kind of bonds they were taken away from them. And though they may not be gang related or anything like that, but all of these same relationships of safety and security and genuine love have been totally interrupted.
Yeah.
And they're just plopped in a new country where they don't know the customs. And of course they're really vulnerable to going into gangs and lots of people do.
Absolutely.
So really start from the beginning and they don't want to tell where they've been, who they've been with, because all that guilt, survival guilt.
Yeah.
Sometimes over time you get to sort of paint a picture in your mind of what they left and,
Yeah.
and specifically what they did.
Yeah, I find that you'll get, you know, if you expect to be able to get a full story when they first arrive, you're likely not to find what you're looking for, but you will get the stories bit by bit, and it does come out because, you know, trauma comes out one way or another. It always is going to come out. So, and it wants to come out. You know, our bodies don't want the trauma. You know, it wants to come out, but it's finding a safe person to tell those things to, being able to let their guard down and share their stories. And it's difficult, but it's you know, it takes time. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, somebody else was.
Yes. So you mentioned before the child's relationship with a spiritual being.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found is like an interesting phenomenon is where a lot of gang members, when they semi-retire and they become kamalu, and they kind of, they usually go with the evangelical church, that it's only the evangelical church. And I'm just curious about, in your experience, why is it that way? Like, is there some kind of historical thing? Is it the way the evangelical church is maybe structured differently than other churches?
Yeah, I mean, I can hypothesize on a couple of those things. I would say, you know, the evangelical church really kind of puts a stress on kind of a salvation experience, right? And so for many of those kids that, you know, I think for a lot of our kids, they grow up Catholic and they think, well, I've always been Catholic even while I was doing these things, so I need to have an experience, you know? So I can maybe hypothesize that may be part of it. I don't know. And I think a lot of times like the culture of gang, it takes a lot from Catholicism. You know, you see our kids with rosaries. Excuse me, guys. You see them with rosaries, and they use those as a way of identifying themselves with their gangs and things of that nature. So I think that sometimes, you know, as you mentioned, that kind of semi-retirement, I think that really the gang doesn't really recognize that unless they see a really like firm line in the sand. Like, I have made a new decision and I'm going on this path and I'm not going to go any other direction again. And so I think that maybe the evangelical church kind of embraces that experience in a way that maybe the Catholic Church hasn't done traditionally. I don't know, you know, that kind of the experience of having this moment of salvation that kind of changes their lives.
And also, I'll say that they emphasize on having a good environment as well. So it's really special from verse 2. I'll say like in the Latino community, there is Catholic. For young people, I mean, we struggle with that. Like, I don't feel like I belong with those. I also want to have things that I can relate that is bilingual as well. So, someone that's like a millennial Catholic Latino, like, you know, like I feel kind of out of place. Because if I go to like an Anglo service, like I do feel that I don't belong. And I feel that a lot of people who are of immigrant backgrounds, they have that feeling as well.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, I'm sorry, but I have to stop you guys because we did run a little late and the next group needs to come in. So if you guys, the sign-in sheet I believe is over there. If you haven't signed, please sign in. All the forms, the evaluation forms, if you just leave them on the table, we'll collect them. And thank you very much, Liz. And
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. You gotta be good.